If you saw my reviews of Sexy Parodios, Ikaruga, and Tyrion, you should know I'm not very good at shooters. I made my hatred for Gradius pretty clear. Couldn't get into Ikaruga, I like Tyrion's standard story mode due to how incredibly accessible it is, but that's far from the norm in the genre. I want to get into more genres I'm generally not into. Shooters can be a bit rough to understand the appeal if you're a newcomer. If you're as bad as I am, you want to start with the beginner-friendly ones, and that requires doing your research. You don't want to pick R-Type as your first experience and end up hating the genre forever because you couldn't even make it past the second level. I've been curious about the Thunder Force series for years, thanks to Thunder Force fans in the Retro Hangover podcast community and YouTube channels like Classic Game Room and GameSack. The shadow of that series kept looming over me. People say they're very hard games, they also said they were easy enough. It took until the Retro Hangover Review Crew voted for Thunder Force 2, nominated by yours truly, for me to finally get hands-on with it. I couldn't review Thunder Force 2 for the Mega Drive and rate it as that's a requirement by the review crew. Or, I could play every single Thunder Force game from the first to the last and make a video about it. Now keep in mind, some of these I had to use emulators for. Even if I could afford them, I couldn't easily import some ancient Japanese computer from the 80s. So if you own the actual hardware and notice something is off about it, well, you'll know why. Once we go through all of the 6 games in this series, since I have to rate Thunder Force 2 anyway, I'm going to rate and rank all of them at the end of the video. And yes, I said every single Thunder Force game, which means we're gonna start with the very first one. Here's Thunder Force for the Sharp X1, and a bunch of other computers from the early 80s. This game looks, sounds, and runs differently depending on what version you run, and there are at least half a dozen versions. They all play the same though. The story puts you in control of Fire Leo, a ship designed to fly to the asteroid converted to a giant base of the evil Orn Empire. You fly in overhead stages to shoot down enemies and drop bombs on turrets. The game is split into scenes, each which is split into 2 parts. The first part requires you to bomb turrets and enemy bases until you fight a shield generator, which you also have to bomb. Once you destroy all of them, you're transported to the second part, where you have to destroy a section of the huge Orn Empire fortress. After that, you move to the next scene, which repeats that cycle. There isn't much variety in what each scene looks like, but this is a 1983 game, so this shouldn't be surprising. There's also no music, which is kind of sad. The Fire Leo is constantly moving with no way to stop. All you can do is change directions and shoot. Your straight shots can't hit turrets and your bombs have a separate button, which makes playing this with its normal keyboard controls feel very uncomfortable. Like most ancient PC games, the clock speed will easily affect the speed of the entire game, so make sure to set to a playable speed when trying to emulate this. Some of the versions run faster or slower even on real hardware. I found the Fujitsu FM7 version the easiest of the bunch. Unfortunately, it's not the best looking by any means. The X1 version feels like the definitive version as far as I could test, as evident by the infamous digitized voice screaming the title of the game. It's pretty difficult though, I couldn't even make it to the fortress even once after playing for over 2 hours. While my dodging skills may be lacking, the choppy scrolling and snapshots of the game combined with the rather eye-straining graphics do make it harder to judge projectiles and enemy speed. In a couple of the versions of the game, the enemy fire is even harder to notice. Sometimes it felt like my inputs were completely ignored, and without turbo it felt almost painful to mash the 2 keys for shooting and bombing fast enough. The X1 version, for example, hitting turrets and bases required way too much of a perfect precision. I guess there is always a chance that's an emulation issue. This clearly didn't age well. You may or may not want to check this one out simply for the novelty of experiencing some of the series' very humble beginnings. There is also a version of the game that includes a stage editor. Unfortunately, I couldn't get any footage of that. While I said I rate every Thunder Force game, I don't think I could judge this one very fairly. This is the only Japanese PC game of its era that I played. Without anything else of that scene to compare, I just couldn't give it a good rating. And no, there is no console port or any kind of modern port of this game available, for better or for worse. There isn't much else to this game, so I say we move on.
Thunder Force Mission 2.
Here's Thunder Force 2 for the Sharp X68000. Most of you know about the Genesis game. Turns out that version is technically a watered down conversion of this version of the game. This time you control the ship X-Elisa and must destroy a new armed mobile battle fortress responsible for blowing up an entire planet. The story takes place years after the destruction of the fortress in the first game. Right from the title screen, you can tell how much the graphics and sound evolved compared to the first game. For a 1988 game, this looks incredible. The game is very colorful and features perfectly smooth parallax scrolling. Smooth also describes the movement of the screen itself. No more choppy scrolling and animations. That doesn't mean the game is easier. Thunder Force 2 gets relentless, especially the side view stages. That's right, this game features overhead and side view gameplay. It's the first Thunder Force to experiment with more traditional horizontal shooting. Unfortunately, while the game features music, it still doesn't have the quality techno software would be known for. It's not bad, it's just not memorable. The overhead levels are the ultimate evolution of what the first game was trying to do. The controls pretty much the same, with the ship constantly moving. The arrow keys allow you to change to any of the 8 directions, and you can rely on short-range bombs to destroy bases and turrets. Another important Thunder Force series to debut in the gameplay is the introduction of the weapon system. Destroying turrets sometimes cause islands to appear, which add more weapons to your arsenal. You can change weapons with the push of a button. By default, you have the regular twin shot and an all-new bi-directional shot that helps you shoot backwards. This also applies to the side view stages, although the power-ups show up in fixed locations instead. Among the power-ups, you also have these small orbs that float around your ship, called claws, which work as shields against some of the enemy fire, but not all of it. They also contribute with extra firepower for some of your weapons. If you lose one life, you also lose all the extra weapons you collected. I'm not a fan of this kind of punishment, but I actually didn't think it was that bad here. The overhead stages are very generous with giving you extra power-ups, and your standard twin shots do decent enough damage to the boss in the side view stages. In fact, aside from the final boss, the real challenge are all the enemies that come at you and getting used to the layout of each stage so you don't crash into anything. Everyone seems to hate the overhead stages. I actually like them way more than the side view stages. There is enough space for you to maneuver around, enemies come in large numbers but all die quickly, and once you get used to being careful with walls and barriers that can close in quickly due to the parallax effect, you find yourself enjoying the feeling of blasting enemies who don't stand much of a chance against a barrage of upgrades. Enemy shields generators are always surrounded by turrets, but if you don't try to rush in your first time, you can easily destroy every one of them without getting shot. I really do think the overhead stages are a lot more accessible than people say, and if you get comfortable enough to memorize the paths to each generator, you can clear the stages in under a minute. The strategies used for this can be pretty crazy, like letting yourself lose a life to fly through barriers and beeline towards the generator. It works better than you think, since clearing in record time scores you multiple extra lives. If the game only featured the overhead stages, I would have probably beaten this version. The side view levels are the true hardcore segments. They often push you ahead way too fast for you to see the obstacles coming. Memorization is part of the side-scrolling shooter experience, but this game goes a little overkill. You have a limited continuous, but I still consider dying to barriers and traps you can't possibly see coming very punishing, since in later levels the difference between being stuck between shots or not when dealing with some of the enemy groups can be brutal. Like I said before, the bosses themselves are not difficult to beat with your standard weapons. Learning the right pattern to dodge their attacks and keep the weak points in your line of fire is the entire battle. Experienced shooter fans will find good challenge here. From my experience though, some shooter fans might not appreciate this game much thanks to the overhead sections.
Excellent.
A year later, the Mega Drive Sega Genesis version came out. This is the version most people are familiar with, as a launch title for the system. This is available on some of the many cheapo Genesis compilation Sega released on newer consoles and PC, and as a part of the Genesis Online app for the Nintendo Switch. I'm playing on Switch here, as M2 was involved in the demolition of Genesis Online and they're the gods of official Genesis emulation. For a launch title, it's pretty impressive, but when you put it next to the X68000 version, you can definitely tell technical sacrifices were made. The graphics are overall a lot more blocky. Everything looks more zoomed in as well, which makes the overhead segments harder. The voice samples are also worse in this version. Not that it makes it easier or harder to understand what they're saying. I had to look it up, and the Mega Drive version they say, while in the Sharp X68000 they say, I guess those 4 extra words were just too powerful for the Sega Genesis to handle. Even with the camera being so close, it shouldn't take long to get used to the flow of overhead stages. They're still generous with the power-ups, and most enemies still die quickly to the right weapons. Bombing turrets and generators is way easier in this version, because the auto-fire is more efficient than ever. There were only 2 overhead stages I had trouble with. This one, which is exclusive to the Genesis version, was one of them. It features a cramped and obnoxious layout that simply doesn't work well for how fast the ship flies. If you can memorize the shortest path to each base, you can probably get away forcing through the barriers, but until you do, this level will be a confusing nightmare. The side view stages are somewhat easier than the 68000 version. They don't feel as fast, and the most dangerous enemies feel very nerfed. You're likely going to die more often to the barriers in the layout than the enemies. The bosses, however, definitely feel tankier. Expect a test of endurance and concentration if you're stuck with your twin shots. This Genesis conversion is lacking 2 levels from the original, 1 overhead and 1 side-scroller. Likely a memory size compromise. I couldn't show you the footage of those original missing levels since I was never able to make it past that damn crawler boss. If you don't care for the overhead gameplay, I don't think you have fun with either version, which seems to be the case for many players. Now this is more like it. When you hear someone praise Thunder Force, this is usually the entry they're talking about. The story once again puts you in control of a pilot fighting against the Orn Empire. Only this time you have to go through 5 different planets in their solar system, locate and destroy the Emperor, and put an end to this ongoing war once and for all. We will surely never hear from the Orn Empire ever again after this. Thunder Force 3 gets rid of the overhead gameplay to focus exclusively on the side-scrolling shooting goodness. You get to choose which planet to start at, each with its own hazards, enemy formations and bosses. Once you clear all 5, you have a few more to go through in a fixed order to reach the final boss. The visual presentation improves once again. It's night and day compared to the bland looking side view stages from the last game. In just 1 year the developers learned some of the cool tricks that Genesis could do, like the warping effect in the background of this fire-themed stage. The difficulty scaling depends a little on what planet you pick. With the default choice of Hydra as the first, I'd say the curve is very well balanced, with the layouts becoming gradually more complicated than simply constant wide spaces. The weapon system from the previous game returns, including old and new weapons, as well as the claws. The twin shots are pretty effective on their own. The extra weapons end up being a lot more useful to counter specific enemy formations and preventing you from being cornered in the middle of a level. The missiles, for instance, work great during sections with too many enemies that move attached to the floors and ceilings. Wave works great against big waves of weak enemies, and Hunter isn't very strong but allows you to focus entirely on dodging while holding auto-fire. Even though I know what the best use for some of the weapons is, I didn't have a lot of trouble remembering to swap quickly. So in the heat of the game I ended up not thinking hard enough and using the wrong weapon often. Speaking of reacting quickly, this game introduces another step of the Thunder Force series. You can manually change the ship's movement speed anytime. I don't have the coordination to do that many things at the same time in a fast-paced game, so I try to stick with the same speed as much as possible. Ideally you want to go with lower speed when you need more sensitive control through narrow spaces and enemy bullets, but keep a faster speed otherwise. When you lose a life, you only lose the weapon you had selected. This is hands down the best change that made sense. It adds some strategy on the risk vs reward element without completely screwing less experienced players up. Think you should save that weapon for a later session in the level, but you're not confident you're not gonna die at least once? No problem, just don't keep it selected until then. This also applies to the upgrades of your default weapons. If you die and you have those selected, you lose the upgrades. One thing about the power-up containers now is that they're very often heading straight to a pit. This is very frustrating if you don't see them coming, but thankfully their spawn locations are always the same. Over time, you also learn not to shoot them as soon as you see them, so you end up with the power-up stuck in a spot you can't hope to reach. Accompanied by one of Technosoft's best soundtracks, this game has a perfect pace for shooter pros looking for a quick run and beginners who want to dip their toes in the genre. Seriously, this is some of the best music in the Genesis. I've been listening to it outside the game very often. This is by far the least overwhelming when it comes to difficulty. It's still not easy, so don't think you're going to reach the end without running out of continues at least a few times. If you can't get into this game, I really don't think side-scrolling shooters will ever be for you.
Standard for Survival Mission. Copyright 1990.
That same year, an arcade conversion of the game was released. That's right, the arcade version is the port, not the other way around. I'm playing the Sega Ages release here. It features extras like Kids Mode if you want an easier time, leaderboards, and unlockables like the ship from Thunder Force 4, even including that ship's weapons. In spite of being an arcade game, the graphical differences between Thunder Force AC and the original Thunder Force 3 are very hard to notice. The difference in stages, however, is not. This game mixes in a stage from Thunder Force 2's side view portions of all things. If you really want a different experience from the Genesis version, this could be a good thing. Personally, I'm not a fan of this. I really didn't care for the stages in Thunder Force 2, revisiting one of them is the last thing I wanted, but it's not the worst thing in the world. I wouldn't put AC on the same level as Thunder Force 3, but it's only marginally worse. It still shares much of that DNA, making it well worth your money. The game is available in 3 formats. If you can buy the PCB board for over $900, the Sega Saturn exclusive Thunder Force Gold Pack 2, which includes this game, for over $80, or you can be smart about it and get the Sega Ages released on Nintendo Switch for $8. It was brought over by M2, so you know the emulation is top notch. Why did the Technosoft game get a Sega Ages release? More on that when we take a look at Thunder Force 6. Thunder Spirits is the first and last Thunder Force game for the Super Nintendo. It's often called a port of Thunder Force 3, but that's not true. This is really a port of Thunder Force AC. You might think that's a pedantic thing to point out, but it's actually helpful to set your expectations straight, because the level layout is based specifically on Thunder Force AC, including that one level from Thunder Force 2. You can definitely see why they never bothered releasing another game for this on the SNES. The system has never been very good for fast-paced shooters. The game features a ton of slowdown whenever there are more than a few projectiles flying on screen. You can hear its weak and inferior CPU screaming in agony every time you play this game. Graphically, it looks fine. The music was never going to sound the same given the difference in hardware. What plays here isn't bad, but the Genesis just sounds more fitting for that trademark Technosoft rocking synth music. If for some reason you have access to Thunder Spirits but none of the other 2 versions, you're still going to have fun. With how much more available 3 and AC are though, that's very unlikely. With all 3 games in front of you, I'd call this one more of a novelty. Thunder Force 4 is the 3rd and last Genesis entry. The footage you see here is from the Sega Ages release on Nintendo Switch. and I can guarantee it's pretty accurate since it features all the slowdown from the original game, which you can reduce with the reduced processing delay option. The Western release was originally called Lightening Force for some reason. By all intents and purposes, both versions are the same. Some people swear there's a difference in enemy and boss behavior, but I couldn't tell, at least not in the Sega Ages version. It stands shoulder to shoulder with 3 in terms of popularity. It's also somewhat polarizing. Depending on who you ask, they either tell you how much they love the game, or how it's way too difficult to be fun. The story takes place a few years after Thunder Force 3. After the defeat of the Orn Emperor, some other evil force known as Vios started gathering what remained of the Orn Empire and began assaulting the Galactic Federation. Yet again, you take control of a new Fire Leo class ship, Rhinox, on a mission to take down this new threat. The whole presentation of the game from start to finish is incredibly polished. With more use of bigger, more detailed enemy sprites, scaling and warping effects, this might be the best looking entry in the entire franchise. Also the hardest. Yeah, most people will probably struggle way more with the first 2 Thunder Force games, but 1 suffers from aging design principles and 2 crosses the line of unfairness more often than not. Thunder Force 4 is brutal but fair, its difficulty feels earned. The difficulty comes from how frantic many sections can get. Unlike with Thunder Force 3, this game will not hesitate to completely surround you in enemy fire regardless of how many power-ups you carry. You have no choice but to figure out the rhythm and patterns. It's not a bullet hell, but it can get pretty close to one sometimes. There are also quite a few gotcha moments in the level design. With good coordination, you can react to them even in your first time though. My own coordination wasn't that good, and I admit this soured my experience quite a bit. The weapon selection, claws, and speed toggle mechanics are all back. Most weapons are new, requiring veterans to readjust to how each of them work. The stages have a more dynamic presentation with the background music changing accordingly. Some sections feature extra verticality, requiring you to scroll up and down farther than what fits the screen. This is supposed to give you more room to move away from enemies, but sometimes it backfires. It's easy to miss power-ups that happen to spawn in a lane you couldn't see, or start to move too far and hit an enemy or an obstacle. When you start the game, you're free to select the order of the first 4 stages. Alternating the order after the inevitable game over is a good way to practice the levels that give you the most trouble. Like the previous game, the levels you show are not all there is to the game. There is a total of 10 stages, with the difficulty increasing significantly in the second half. After one of the later stages, you gain the new Thunder Sword ability, which you can use as long as you still have claws. This weapon when fully charged is incredibly strong, but to charge it you have to hold fire, which could leave you vulnerable. This prevents you from simply abusing it to make the game trivial and rewards you for taking that risk. In addition to the beautiful visuals, the game follows up TF3's music with its own fantastic tracks. It definitely has a different style, and I happen to prefer the style of Thunder Force 3. Still, this is another good one that you might want to listen to even when not playing the game. The more you're into shooters, the more likely this is going to be the number 1 Thunder Force for you. In style, it might beat all the other games. Its frantic pace feels awesome when you actually know what you're doing. However, if like me you still suck at shooters, this game is going to kick your ass so hard you might end up feeling like you're not learning anything. Keep at it though. If I had the time, I would have spent longer getting better at the game, but I had to have this video ready before the end of the month. I'll definitely play more of this ever so often. A year before the next entry, Technosoft released 2 compilation discs for the Sega Saturn to build hype for Thunder Force 5. Thunder Force Gold Pack 1 features the Mega Drive version of Thunder Force 2 and Thunder Force 3. Gold Pack 2 included 4 and AC. Both compilations feature animated intros, but the games themselves are pretty much straight ports. For Sega Saturn standards, the gold packs are not super expensive, but you're still looking at well over $80 a disc, and I'm pretty sure even getting the Genesis cards is cheaper. Anyway, not much else to say about these packs, we've gone through these games already. After the longest gap in the series release schedule so far, Thunder Force 5 came out on the Saturn. A PlayStation version branded as Thunder Force 5 Perfect System came out a year later. Only the PlayStation version was localized in the West, courtesy of Working Designs. Working Designs is notorious among retro gamers for how much they love to change the game scripts and even mess with the balance in the gameplay. I'm on the camp that believes localization teams should not have this level of control, but regardless of what any of us think, the work on this game might as well have been their best. The voice acting, although limited to one CG cutscene, is very good. The translation seems pretty faithful. I keep hearing Working Designs made the PlayStation version harder, but I couldn't find any evidence of this. The only change is that you have to play on normal difficulty or higher to see the complete game. Anyway, this time you take control of the ship Vambrace, piloted by Sinus Crawford, whose face they show to you a few times in CG cutscenes. The story this time is, well, here, let me read it for you. An unmanned research probe launched by the Earth Aeronautics and Space Administration reaches the Oort cloud, an enormous ring of comets encircling the outer limits of the solar system. The world's best and brightest scientists analyze the alien objects and breakthroughs that reveal the found discovery quickly determines the dazzling findings of the ships are built and everything studying vast. The world wants to government selects and combines technical tell galaxy science and a gigantic man-made what the ships and numbers now unleash the heart. Or in simple terms, humans create AI to build ships to colonize planets, AI goes evil, you control the ship Vambrace and you gotta destroy the AI. I'm not opposed to more complex stories in games, but all these giant walls of text that tell the story are just that. Walls of text in a separate menu, and all you see in the actual game is ship flying, make things go boom. I don't feel very invested in all that extra lore. It's okay though, because the game itself is awesome fun. The spectacle of Thunder Force 4 is preserved, but you no longer have to deal with the extra verticality. The gameplay is streamlined back to the style of Thunder Force 3, just good old scrolling from the left to the right. Weapons from previous games returned, and so do claws, now called crawls for some reason. From the very start, the game features a mechanic similar to the Thunder Sword from Thunder Force 4, called Overweapon. The Overweapon is a supercharged version of the weapon you have selected. You can use it anytime you have a claw with you, but you will consume some of the claw's energy. If the claw is in its weakened red colored state, it will get destroyed by enemy fire. To avoid spending all your 3 claws at once, you're supposed to avoid spamming Overweapon too quickly and wait for them to recharge. This is the single most important mechanic in the game, and while you shouldn't spend it too much, the game will throw spare claws at you very often. The level design expects you to use Overweapon often, and the sooner you get used to that, the sooner you get familiar with the new bonus mechanic. Killing one enemy after another within a short amount of time gives you score multipliers as bonus. The weapons are all easy to use, with the exception of free range. Free range might look similar to the freeway weapon from Thunder Force 4, but it's not actually the same thing. Instead of firing a barrage of missiles, you fire these misleadingly puny looking lasers, and controlling the target direction is very clunky. Learning is more than worth it, because this weapon nearly breaks the game. It's not an exciting or flashy weapon, but it's extremely powerful, and if you can keep bossing its line of sight, you can make very short work of them. The game abandons sprites in favor of 3D models, which makes it lose to 4 in the visual presentation. 3D, especially from this era, just doesn't age well. Even so, I absolutely love the presentation style in this game. I don't care if most retro games despise PlayStation 3D graphics, I don't think they're that bad in a game where all models are supposed to be machines. Besides, this allows for some cool shots and perspective changes during transitions. There were way better looking 3D shooters out on the PlayStation before this version came out, like Einhander, which do make this look ugly by comparison. All you gotta do is pretend they don't exist. The soundtrack doesn't feature as many memorable level tracks as the series' previous 2 entries, but it has its share of great ones. The heavy use of synth and energetic guitars, which should be associated with the series, are still present. The menu has an interesting style to it, simulating a computer terminal with its own unique operating system boot animation. This makes me wish I could appreciate all the excessive lore a bit more. The background is hard to defend, I gotta admit that. They look pretty bland and empty. In fact, most of the levels don't have a lot going on for the obstacles in the layout themselves. Two mainly flat or empty wide corridors with enemy ships coming. I don't mind this too much because I play these games for the enemies and bosses, not so much to avoid colliding with objects I can't shoot. The bosses are the best part. We're not just melting them with free range, they're the main challenge in the game and are very satisfying to beat. Every boss has multiple phases and I feel the designers were very proud of them because they all come with some cool introduction phase shift presentation. Don't worry though, they only take a couple seconds. You can also unlock a boss rush mode where you're supposed to speedrun bosses to keep a timer from reaching 0. In one of the later levels you get to combine your ship into another, called Brigandine. The Brigandine has a shield that functions as a health bar and its shots are extremely powerful. The drawback is that it's so big and heavy that it makes you a bigger target, and your speed is decreased. In the story mode you only use it briefly until it gets destroyed, and it will get destroyed, trust me. Its shield gauge goes down fast. It's a shame the Brigandine is basically a glorified bonus level. But once you unlock the option to use the boss rush, you realize this is probably for the best. It's a cool little mechanic, but there isn't a lot of depth to it and it gets old rather fast. I'd say the difficulty of this one is just right. It's not a terrible pick for beginners as long as you have no intention of actually beating it. The last few bosses are pretty challenging. The final boss is pretty insane on its own, with patterns that change based on your reactions, and the game still requires you to beat it on a timer soon to get the bad ending. And if you don't find the game hard enough, try unlocking the Master Mode. This is actually the first Thunder Force game I saw in action way back when I was a kid. My brother beat the game and got the good ending, making me think this would have been one of the easier Thunder Force games for years and years. Then I played the game for this video and his accomplishment sounds like a huge deal now, because getting the good ending without cheating feels impossible to me. You may or may not have noticed I've been showing a lot of PlayStation footage. Well, I did end up sticking with the PlayStation version to beat it. The two versions offer nearly the same experience if you're only in for the story mode. The Saturn version has better graphics with some extra layers of background detail which you can see in a few of the levels. The PlayStation version, however, runs very smoothly, features better sound, includes more CG cutscenes and features extra artwork and modes. Unless you're a hardcore Sega Saturn fan, I just consider Perfect System the definitive version. Thunder Force 6 came out in 2008 for the PlayStation 2. It took long enough for the series to be considered dead, and it almost was. You see, after the release of Thunder Force 5, Technosoft fell into a financial decline. In 2001 they were acquired by a company called 21 Company. 21 wasn't doing anything with Technosoft's IPs until years later when it became known a trademark for Thunder Force 6 was filed. 2008 came and Thunder Force 6 was announced under development of Sega. It was released in October 30 that same year and never left Japan. This game was not made by Technosoft itself or any of the original Thunder Force staff. It was directed by Tetsuo Kano, director of the worldwide sensation Sega Gaga. Let's be frank here, with a fresh gene, a late PS2 release when the PlayStation 3 was almost 2 years old, and a short development cycle, this game was never going to reach the quality standards of the series. But what they were able to do wasn't necessarily bad. The story takes place 10 years after the ending of Thunder Force 5. The leader of the Vios from Thunder Force 4 comes back as Orn Faust and attacks the Earth. You control Phoenix, a new model of ship that uses refined Vasteel technology as it flies to the capital of the Galactic Federation to join forces with them and take down Orn Faust. The presentation is as pretty as it is bland. The visuals and graphics are clean and still look great even today. You can tell this is a late PS2 release. The only problem is the levels and backgrounds look somehow even more empty than before. And I don't know if it's just me, but there's a serious lack of personality to the game. The only reason we know this is a Thunder Force game is because it's in the title and its least bland level sections are just copied homework from segments in previous games' levels. Like this section, which is a straight rehash of one Thunder Force 5's levels. Some of those complaints are very subjective, but what isn't subjective is the length. The levels in this game are way too short. They end where you think should have been the halfway point. And the bosses were built using the weakest metal and silicon in the universe. Keep in mind I played this in the default normal difficulty. This game has 2 other easier difficulties and 2 harder ones. I don't even think it's a lack of difficulty that is the problem. I lost a lot of lives. The problem is the game doesn't do a good job punishing you. If you lose all lives and choose to spend a continue, you're back exactly where you died. The amount of continues you have are more than enough to brute force to the end if you feel like it. And the starting ship doesn't even lose weapons when it's destroyed. The only compliments I have for this game are the good graphics and smooth performance. I felt completely empty when I reached the ending. I tried to play around with the first unlockable ship for a little while, which thankfully works like the other Thunder Force ships. And I know you can unlock another one, but I don't want to. I think the disconnect is even stronger with the bizarre decision to have the characters speak using an ancient dead branch of Chinese language and Mongolian. Were the Orns supposed to speak Mongolian, or did they think Mongolian sounded alien? I know this game has its fans, but sorry, I'm not one of them. If you still want to try it yourself, your choices are very limited. This game was never re-released. Now, before you go thinking the Thunder Force series is dead and we will never see Thunder Force 5 or 6 be released or localized or maybe even remastered, this franchise's history is not over. Remember when I asked if it wasn't a little curious that these Technosoft games were brought back as Sega Ages releases? That's because in 2016, 21 companies sold off all of Technosoft's game library to Sega. And it's not just the rights to re-release those old games either. Sega officially owns all of Technosoft's intellectual properties now. That's also why Herzog Zwei took so long to get a re-release. Sega does own a lot of IPs they don't do a lot with, but I do think the future for the Thunder Force series is brighter than it has ever been since the early 2000s. The worst scenario is we get all but the first game accessible on modern consoles, and that's not a bad scenario. Anyway, before we wrap up the video, it's time to rate and rank the games. I'm not including Lightening Force or the Saturn version of Thunder Force 5 as separate games for this list. Thunder Force, the first game, isn't gonna get a rating, but I'm placing dead last. It's interesting, but it aged very poorly and just doesn't feel good to play. Thunder Force 2 for the sharp 68,000 gets a 4 out of 10. I'm probably never gonna touch this game again. It's not awful, but I just think the side view stages are very unpleasant. And the overhead stages are alright, but suffer from the finicky bomb targeting. Thunder Force 6 gets a 5 out of 10. 5 is what I consider to be harmless but pure mediocrity. You could definitely find many shooters that look and play worse, but this one is nothing without its rehashed ideas and the experience is cut way too short. Thunder Force 2 for the Sega Genesis gets a 5 out of 10 as well. I can respect how much it showcases what the Genesis can do in its launch year, and I found 3 of the overhead stages fun to play. The side view stages are almost as bad as the 68,000 version, that cave overhead level is just too much. It looks worse than the 68,000 version, but it plays much better. Thunder Spirits gets a 7 out of 10. It suffers from serious slowdown problems, the audio just isn't that great without the sharp quality of the AC original, and playing a space shooter on the Super Nintendo feels almost like a capital offense. It's still a version of Thunder Force AC though, which means it's also a good time. Thunder Force 4 for the Sega Genesis gets an 8 out of 10. It's only this low because I suck at the game and miss out on a lot of the payoff of the full experience. It's the best looking one and the ultimate shooter lover's entry of the series. I didn't care for the extra vertical scrolling though. Thunder Force AC gets another 8 out of 10. It's really good, but I think the Thunder Force 2 level drags the experience down. Thunder Force 3 also gets an 8. I think it's the most balanced of the series, and in its default difficulty, it's a good beginner shooter. It features a kick-ass soundtrack of the kind you only hear in good Japanese Genesis games and deserves a ton of respect for defining the series' identity. And finally, Thunder Force 5 Perfect System. Getting a 9 out of 10, this is my number 1 Thunder Force game. I thought the levels themselves would make me want to put this under Thunder Force 3, but the more I think about it, the more I identify myself more with the style and presentation of 5. Yeah, he uses 3D models and you all think sprites are superior, I don't care. I really don't think the models look that bad, and this is my list. If you've watched all the way here, thank you very much. This was one of my most difficult videos to work at. Any comments and support are much appreciated. And if you liked it, feel free to check out my other reviews. There is stuff from Atari 2600 all the way to the PlayStation 5. Whatever piques my interest and I'm able to finish. As always, thanks for watching and take care.